Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
So it's not the government's preferred option. But when Theresa May did her deal with the EU in December, they insisted on a backstop arrangement to prevent a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. The government's been trying to turn that agreement into a legal text to put to EU negotiators. But the negotiations in Downing Street over it have been fraught, to say the least. Joining me to discuss all of this is the former Conservative leader and Brexiteer Ian Duncan-Smith, Irish Brexit spokesman Senator Neil Richmond, and The Times' Sam Coates, who's been doing a lot of the running on this story. Welcome to all of you. Sam Coates, what's going on?
If I knew that, I'd be rich. Honestly, this is a story that's unfolding minute by minute. About an hour ago, journalists were told by senior Whitehall people that a deal had been done, that the document would be published today, and that everything was back on track. In other words, the row of the last 24 hours was over. In the last minute or two, there are just starting to be reports that Theresa May will once again see David Davis, and things are not quite concluded. So we are waiting for an absolute resolution. Somebody somewhere has made some progress this morning, and we're trying to find out what it is. Now, as it stands, my understanding is that the document on the backstop hasn't yet changed, but maybe there'll be instructions to change it in the coming hour or two. It's got to be handed over to Brussels today or tomorrow. That's what Downing Street would like to do. So what is it that Theresa May has done or can do to get David Davis back on side? That's the big question. We're all frantically looking at our phones to find out what it is. Now, it's clear to me that David Davis is not alone in his unhappiness with where the proposal was going. And there is a chance that all the Brexiteers in Cabinet line up behind him. So Theresa May could be in quite a perilous position if she doesn't want to climb down to him on the issue of the backstop. But at the same time, it's hard to see how she can, given the kinds of plans that Europe will accept.
How furious was David Davis? We seem to know, because it was clarified on Twitter to some extent, that he was on the verge of resigning.
So we've been here before. David Davis is a regular threatened to resign, or indeed he has resigned twice before. So this is not uncharted territory. And if I'm being completely brutal and sort of unjournalistic, I get conflicting reports. Some people who saw him yesterday said he was giving off no vibes whatsoever of resigning, but then he appeared to pick up the phone to journalists and appeared to say some stuff that appeared to lead to reports that said that he would. Different people are saying different things depending on who their audience are. That's not the first time that's ever happened in politics, but it does mean that as of 3 minutes past 12, we're not quite sure what's going on.
Do you share David Davis's concern? And the concern is that there has to be a strict time limit on this backstop proposal, so that any alignment to the EU on the customs union beyond transition is time limited. It seemed that that was being taken out of the proposal and that was what caused David Davis to resign. If that is the case, should he quit?
Well, first of all, I have to say I don't know exactly the details of what's going on behind closed doors. He probably knows more than I do.
but I've outlined what the parameters are. If there isn't a time limit, in other words, the UK could stay in perpetuity, closely aligned to the EU, should he quit?
Do I think that is a good idea? The answer is categorically no. I don't think the backstop is a great idea either, by the way, because I think the whole point is this can be resolved, all this stuff resolved, if the political parties involved, the Irish, the British, dare I say it, the EU, actually decide they want to solve this problem before we actually leave. The backstop was there only as a what if we can't, how long for? But there is another problem pending. It's at the end of all of this. You can't simply leave an open-ended process. We will be running to an election in some 2 years after that. And the idea that the UK would still be bumping along inside the customs union by the time you hit the next election is politically intolerable. But secondly, it also opens the door to the EU 27 just to throw a delay into the whole thing if they don't want, because they'll simply say, oh, well, we're still going to have to go round everybody, no one's absolutely happy, you can't go till we've all agreed it. All of a sudden, the power dynamic moves across to the other side. So I would say, if your chief negotiator wants to have some kind of defined end to this process, if he is your chief negotiator, then you probably have to give it to him.
Otherwise, he should quit.
It's up to him. I never advise people what to do.
No, but it's not
myself.
about...
I'm not a great believer in telling other people what to do. They can do what they like, really. But
if he doesn't quit, it will be a sellout. He will have sold out and you will have sold out.
Well, I'm not selling out because I'm not in there doing it, but I have already expressed my views on this. I think, basically, this whole nonsense around the border, and I really do think it is a nonsense, because I think if people of goodwill will resolve this matter, at the moment it's being used as a stick to beat a dog over the negotiations. I think it's sad that it is, because I think there's more in it than that, and I think, therefore, if the government of Ireland and the government of the UK sit down, as they always have done in the past, and resolve this matter themselves, all is resolvable within the timescale. But this backstop becomes a political stick, and it shouldn't be there.
Right. Should, though, David Davis, is this the point? You say it would become politically intolerable if this was allowed to run and run in terms of Britain's close association or alignment to the EU's customs union. Should he take a stand? Should this be the moment?
Look, I don't know what he's doing, and I don't know what the government's doing internally.
What's your view? Would you like him to take a stand on this?
Look, I'm not going to get into that game. All I know is that it's a game at the end of the day. Who's going to
he's the one who's threatened to resign.
All I'm saying to you is that my view, you've asked for my view, here is my view. The Prime Minister indicated that this would be time limited. That was always the clear understanding. The only question is, when is that time limit to be specified, and what is it? That's the only question, not whether it will be time limited, it's when and what will that time limit be.
Well, as Sam Coates has said, David Davis has actually gone back into Downing Street. But let's have a look at the Brexit Secretary a little earlier today, when he left Downing Street number 10, but went back to his own office.
Are you going to resign, Mr. Davis? Will you get your way on the customs backstop? Have you won over the Prime Minister?
Well, that was David Davis there. Do you think he is in an impossible situation?
Well, I think it's a very difficult situation. If you are the chief negotiator, then you need to be trusted to negotiate. And if you believe, as he fundamentally does, and by the way, I think most of the party does too, that you need to have a very clear end stop to this, then I think, and I'm sure the Prime Minister will come to some agreement with him about when that's defined and how it is. It's not, the point is, it's not a case of whether, it's a case of when and what that timescale is.
Right. Neil Richmond, first of all of this could be sorted out. It's all a load of nonsense, all of the opposition and the difficulties that the government is finding over the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland.
No, there's a lot there that Ian said that I absolutely just simply disagree with. It's not based in fact. The situation on the island of Ireland is we're 20 years into an extremely fragile peace process that we're trying to resolve, and we have to maintain that. The will of both the European and British negotiating sides is there is no hard border on the island of Ireland. How that is maintained is something that we're trying to negotiate in Brussels. However, 2 years on from Brexit, a year on from triggering Article 50, and 6 months on from a binding political agreement in December, we've yet to see the British government come with any tangible proposals. We hope to see a paper this afternoon, we hope to see it brought to Brussels, and we hope to see Michel Barnier's comments on Friday. However, we've been waiting an awfully long time. Both the British and European sides have agreed that the situation on the island of Ireland is a top 3 negotiating issue, and it's for very good reasons. The Good Friday Agreement is an international peace agreement lodged with the United Nations, of which the British and Irish governments are co-guarantors. And a key thing in this whole discussion, Ireland is Europe. We are remaining as part of the 27 EU member states. This cannot be a Dublin-London negotiation. When you talk about the European Union, that's Ireland. And as soon as people realise that Michel Barnier is our negotiator, we might get an element of progress. Trying to split Ireland off from the remaining 27 isn't successful. It's worth noting that in the last opinion poll, 92% of Irish people want to stay within the European Union.
Right. Ian Duncan-Smith?
Well, I'm sure they do, and I don't have an interest in the internal politics of Ireland, but...
But you do, by Brexit is forcing...
No, I don't. Well, I actually have a view, which is I think the Irish government could be doing a lot more positive about actually settling this. The first thing is, all of this...
You don't realise it's the European Union who's negotiating. Stop trying to split us off.
I did interrupt you for a second, okay? Let me just say something. The real point is that the big issue is what kind of trade relationship we will have with the EU afterwards. And this is the vital question, because that then sets and settles almost everything to do with what kind of border relations you have, both with Ireland and the rest of the EU. And given that Ireland's trade massively is with the UK, you'd think that that would be a #1 priority for them to actually get involved in and help get onto that as quickly as possible,
Well, let Neil
instead of
respond.
this ridiculous linear negotiation which stops us getting onto trade unless we have some Loctite view about where the border will be.
For a start, it's factually incorrect. When we joined the EEC in 1973, 60% of our exports went to the United Kingdom. It's now down to 12%. That's behind the United States, behind Belgium, and indeed behind the whole European Union as a whole. Our biggest market remains the European Union, of which we're staying part of. We want to maintain the closest possible trading and customs relationship with the United Kingdom as an entire European entity post-Brexit. We haven't made this decision, but ultimately both the British and European negotiating sides have identified 3 key priority 1 issues, and unfortunately 2 years after Brexit, we're still talking about the Irish border. We haven't seen the proposals.
Why don't you get on to talking about trade? Why don't you sit down
Because
and
we've
get
agreed,
the EU to move on
because we've
to
agreed,
trade?
as is the British government,
Well, it's
that we
ludicrous.
won't. No, because we
It's
haven't
the most
had.
ludicrous negotiation timetable I have ever seen.
But the British government said it.
Well, it's ridiculous.
The
No,
British
you
government
set
said
that
it.
timetable.
But the British government agreed
And
to it.
actually,
They triggered
no,
Article
but
50. You
actually,
can't throw it on us.
I'm sorry. The Irish government could be really playing a good role in here and
Irish
saying,
government
let's
is
get
playing
on
a
to
good
trade,
role.
let's settle the trade issue, and we will do
And
in
when we get to
parallel
the trade
the border
negotiations,
issues.
Ireland will always remain the United Kingdom's best friend within the European Union. However, trying to push the situation and trying to blame Ireland for everything is completely
Ireland.
irresponsible.
I'm saying that Ireland's
Ultimately,
interested in
Hang on, let him
trade.
finish.
Brexit is a decision of the British people. It is up to the British government to therefore at least define some way that they'd like to see Brexit to be.
All right.
We have yet to see any evidence or any detail about what they want the relationship
And
to be.
just before I go to Downing Street to talk to our political editor, I mean, it's true, isn't it, Ian Duncan-Smith, if David Davis, with support from Brexiteers like you, said, let's have that backstop presented to the EU, the backstop that says we will remain closely aligned to the EU, let's not put a time limit on it, that would unlock the negotiations that you're so keen to move on to.
And no, I don't think they're the main sticking point behind the negotiations. The backstop is not the key. Is not the key issue. I think the reality here is, come June, it's whether or not the EU really wants to get onto trade negotiations or not. We're 14 months in, and we still haven't talked about what our relationship
You say it's
will
not.
be
You
afterwards.
say it's not the key on the backstop, but it's pretty well the key right at this very moment. If we've had a Brexit secretary who's threatened to resign and a government that cannot get agreement in order to present that proposal to the European Union. So Laura Kunsberg is outside number 10. Laura, I hope you can hear me from the studio. Do we have any idea of what is in the proposal that is expected to be presented to the EU? Has it been signed off?
Oh, well, there's 2 things there, Joe. Yeah, we do have a very clear idea of what's in the proposal, an idea for a temporary customs arrangement where the UK would still have very close links with the European Union, would still have to accept some rulings of the European Court. Has it been signed off? Well, no, it hasn't. And as we speak, David Davis has been called back in to see the Prime Minister again. They met for an hour in the House of Commons this morning, but that meeting, I understand, ended without any agreements. But in the last 10 minutes or so, rather than the cabinet meeting of the inner Brexit team that's meant to start in the next 15 minutes or so, right now the 2 main protagonists in this drama are trying to find a way through. And I'm not really sure if it is a question of compromise. I think it's a question of who is going to back down. And it's pretty clear from some of the conversations I've been having this morning that if the Prime Minister doesn't roll over and back down in the face of David Davis's demands about all of this, he may very well pack up his bags from number 9 Downing Street, just down there, and leave the government. And what happens after that? Well, could be anyone's guess. But I should say this, it may well be that by the end of the day, all is calm, compromises have been arranged, and that, you know, privately there's fury, but publicly the government is, you guessed it, getting on with the job.
Right, so is this the moment, though, of maximum danger, if you like, for Theresa May? Is this the moment, as we've been discussing, that David Davis, her Brexit secretary, as Ian Duncan-Smith described, the main man, as far as he's concerned, in the negotiations, holds a sort of Damocles sword over her head over this issue of a time limit to any alignment of the UK to the EU's customs union?
Yeah, Joe, this is a very, very dangerous moment, one that reminds me of what happened in December, where again, number 10 and the Whitehall machine believed that they had a deal that would be sellable to Brussels, that they could get through the Parliamentary Party and Brexiteers. And then Brexiteers had a good chance to have a look at it and went, hang on a minute, we can't live with that, we can't put up with that at all. So David Davis is cross about this proposal, and it does seem pretty staggering that the political handlers in number 10 didn't manage to get the man in charge of Brexit policy in agreement with there and behind this paper before they were going to publish it. But it may well be that this is the moment where he walks off in frustration at what many people see as the Prime Minister's reluctance to show what her position really is. You know, this frustration has been building on both sides for many, many months now. Brexiteers frustrated that the Prime Minister won't argue more forcefully for what they would see as a clean Brexit. She won't push Brussels, she won't stand up to the Remain forces as they would see it. And on the other side, you've got some very powerful Remain voices in Cabinet and on the backbenches who are saying, come on, Theresa May, you have to face these people down, as they would see it. That's the only way you're going to be able to get any compromise. Now, Theresa May, frankly, has been able to stay in office because she has been tiptoeing across this line in the middle. She's had to give a little bit here and then a little bit there. That's how she has survived. But people have darkly for many months talked about there will be a moment when she has to choose. It could be, Joe, that this is it.
Right. I mean, if she doesn't stand up to the EU as some Brexiteers see it and David Davis sees it, it will be a sellout, won't it, of the Brexit vision that she set out so very clearly. The negotiating position for the UK will be shot to pieces. The EU will be have no motivation to actually come back and negotiate anything towards the UK's advantage.
Well, that's, of course, the fear, is if you put a proposal on the table that basically would mean, as Brexiteers would see it, it's Hotel California, we've checked out but we never really leave, then, of course, where would the incentive be for the European Union to come up with creative solutions? Where would the incentive be for them to compromise? And also, where would the incentive for Remainers inside government to try to push towards a new solution? But the other problem in all of this, sorry, there's just a bit of shouting, so I need to keep just checking behind me to see if I miss any skullduggery or anybody coming and going. Yeah, because actually a while ago, I should tell you, Boris Johnson emerged, walked down Downing Street and went through the back somewhere. And we don't know if he went into number 10 or if he went into number 9 to go and have a little powwow with David Davis. So as soon as we find out what really happened there, we'll bring that to you.
Will there be resignation?
But in terms of one of the many problems behind all of this is that this is meant to be the insurance policy. All this fuss over the backstop, it's meant to be the insurance policy. That's what Downing Street will say. Shouldn't be having all this rumpus because it's never going to come to pass. The problem is, not very many people have faith in number 10,
yes,
that the other proposals are actually workable.
All right.
So it looks to many people as if the insurance policy is the real policy. And before I disappear down any more kind of Kafkaesque rabbit holes, it's a question of trust and faith in the number 10 machine. And on the Remain side and on the Brexit side, right now, there is just simply not much faith and trust that they are actually doing a good job. And one senior MP said to me this morning with real frustration, the fact is they are just not good enough. And that's the really dangerous message, not just around here for Theresa May's future, but also for people watching all of this in the European Union.
Well, Laura, we'll let you watch the famous black door to see if anybody else comes in and out, and we'll come back to you if there's any more news. Pfizer, listening to all of this and watching the way this is all unfolding, do you think now that Brexit, in the way that Theresa May outlined it, leaving the single market, leaving the customs union, is now under threat?
That I've been not clear about what the plan is for a long time, like a lot of people. I was just in Paris last week with a whole bunch of execs from Europe and the US, and then ministers from France and Germany. Every time they spoke about the UK, it was with a smirk. Like, literally, this government right now is making us look like a joke. It's embarrassing, and people's jobs and livelihoods are on the line. And the only thing I can conclude, really, from looking at the last 2 years and these political shenanigans and the lack of vision and strategy, is that either people that have been wanting Brexit to happen for decades, like Ian Duncan Smith, have misled people and talked out what's possible, or they are just grossly incompetent. And people are probably thinking both right now.
Right. I mean, do we look a joke in the negotiations?
I think with the one bit of European negotiations where most of the 27 can agree in the face of a lot of very difficult European issues, from Italy to what's going on in the East. I think it's very easy to go down rabbit holes on this. We're talking about the international justiciability and the wording of a backstop proposal. But it all comes back to one big thing, which is that 2 years after the referendum, Theresa May and her cabinet and the government and Parliament have not decided the fundamental question of Brexit, which is this: are we going to be quite close to the European Union in how we exist post-Brexit, or are we going to take a big leap and try and forge a relationship with Asian countries, fast-growing economies, and try and change the way that we do our economy and our society in order to take advantage of other opportunities. That fundamental decision is what's going on today in microcosm.
Yes.
And it's one bit of because she hasn't taken the big decision, these techie little things, and I could forgive everybody for not understanding the detail, these techie little things can't get resolved because they haven't worked out the big picture plan, and that is the frightening.
Well, and this is a proxy for that conundrum, as you have put it out. Do we stay closely aligned or do we move further away from Europe? Does this, if today does become a day when there is a resignation, does that lead to an election, a leadership election, or even a general election further down the line, or is that another rabbit hole?
What it might do is lead to a settled view that Brexit isn't being delivered. Quite whether that results in a general election is very complicated because there are rules in place to stop a general election. I can't see anybody in their right mind on the Conservative Party or in the DUP voting for that, which you would need to do. But I think it will be incredibly toxic for politics if all of a sudden a whole bunch of Brexiteers just say that thing that you voted for 2 years ago is just suddenly not happening.
Has anyone asked you, Ian Duncan-Smith, for your support in their leadership campaign?
No.
Nobody in the House of Commons has come up to you? Nobody has been going around the tea rooms talking to people that in the event that there were a vacancy, I'll be running?
No.
What do you think of what Sam Coates has said in terms of that fundamental argument? Will you feel betrayed if, in the end, it is not the big leap away from the EU, that in the end, because Parliament supports it, it'll be a much closer relationship?
Well, to be fair to Theresa May, I think she has defined in her speeches what it is. If you're leaving the customs union, the single market, taking back control of your laws, your borders, your money, then you are taking a much more detached position from your relationship with the European Union. The question then remains, and that's defined, the question then remains, what is that relationship between the two? And that can only be decided eventually when the European Union sits down and decides what it actually wants from it and puts that on the table alongside what the UK wants. And my point about this from the very beginning, and I have been critical from the very beginning, I did not think the government should have signed up to the European Union's negotiating stance. We should have been talking about the trading relationship first. That may have met exactly the point that you were making, which is that is the bigger picture. What's the relationship going to be? And from that, everything else flows. We've done it exactly the wrong way round.
All right.
Because you can't do it until you get to trade.
Well,
that's what we should be doing right now.
That terrible expression, we are where we are, Ian Duncan-Smith.
Are we?
Well, I think so. More Kafkaesque comments here. Let's talk to Adam Fleming, who's in Brussels. Our man in Brussels, in fact. So this proposal, Adam, was supposed to have reached EU negotiators today. I presume it hasn't yet because it doesn't look as if there has been sign-off and David Davis is still talking to Theresa May. What is the atmosphere? What are the expectations in Brussels?
So whenever you phone people dealing with Brexit in Brussels at the moment, the first thing they do is ask me what's happening and whether David Davis is going to stay as the Brexit secretary.
You've become very important in these negotiations, haven't you, Adam?
Yeah, basically. No, that's why it's good to listen to 20 minutes of the Daily Politics to actually find out.
Well done.
Anyway, let's get back to the substance of it. So I've been sent a list of questions that the EU will have about this UK customs proposal when it finally lands here in Brussels. And I'll go through them now. They're on my phone. Is it temporary? And what is the language about how long it will last? Because the EU doesn't want what they described as then having to discuss a backstop to the backstop. To what extent does the UK's proposal today solve the issue with the Irish border? Because remember, that is what the UK's intention in the talks this week with this paper is, which is to provide an alternative solution to avoiding a hard border on the island of Ireland, an alternative to the proposal that's been put forward by the EU, which Theresa May said she couldn't sign up to. Then does the UK proposal respect the integrity of the EU's existing customs architecture? So surveillance, fraud, how do you deal with possibly illegal imports of Chinese subsidised steel, things like that? Then does the EU need to change its customs policy as a result of this? And what does it do about alignment with EU's rules and regulations, which is, remember, the other half of the equation when it comes to avoiding a hard border in Northern Ireland, because that's not just about customs, it's also about rules and regulations. So that's the list of tests that the EU has about this paper when they finally get to read it. I was chatting to somebody who's very close to the EU side of the negotiations, and I said, hang on, haven't you already pre-rejected this, projected what the UK is going to put on the table? Intriguingly, they said, no, we haven't. We've just got this list of questions about it. So it's definitely not dead on arrival, as some commentators are suggesting.
OK, Adam, thank you very much in Brussels. We'll leave you and your questions and wait and see when that proposal does land in Brussels. Neil Richmond, are you looking more for guidance on the UK's position to the UK Parliament than the UK government?
No, the European negotiating team is negotiating in absolute good faith with David Davis and Theresa May, and that's the way the negotiation has been set up. And we can only, you can get lost talking about the internal dynamics of British politics. It's fascinating for us. We're addicted to watching British politics, but ultimately we have to negotiate directly with the Prime Minister and her Brexit Secretary. And as I said, we've been waiting an awful long time to get some detail. We have a political agreement from December. We've presented a legal interpretation of that. It's now up for the British to present their alternative. We haven't got it yet. We will obviously engage and read anything that comes, which we've always been open. We're open to any solutions, but we agree that the best solution is a deep and meaningful trading and customs relationship.
But you'd be happy, wouldn't you, if the UK did remove any time limit to remaining closely aligned to the EU's customs union? You'd be happy with that, wouldn't you? And then just leave it.
No, there's a lot more to that, and that's what we need to see. We need to see the paper, we need to see detail. We can't comment solely on hypotheticals. And one thing that's very clear is the backstop agreed in December for Ireland has to be solid, and it can't have a time limit.
Now, just to return briefly to David Davis, your colleague, he's still talking to Theresa May, and we'd all love to know what is being discussed. But this from another Conservative MP, Nadine Dorries, who tweeted, David Davis is ex-SAS. He's trained to survive. He's also trained to take people out. Hashtag Brexit. Do you like that sentiment?
Nadine has her own way of expressing political views. It's not exactly how I would describe it. I think that given the nature of this is always going to be, because of the nature of the government, don't have a majority, so that's the key thing. It's about negotiation internally as much as external negotiation. So
who should he take out, do you think, David Davis?
Well, you know, he can take out Nadine if he likes.
But in the cabinet,
I don't think he wants to go taking anybody out physically.
In the cabinet, I mean, I'm not talking literally. Who should be taken out by David Davis in the cabinet that would sort it out for you?
Listen, I'm not going to go down that road because I have my own views about individual competence, but I will leave them for myself. I think we simply say that we have, as usual, an internal negotiation going on. If we've done it once, we've done it 50 times, and at some point we'll bump into this.
Final word from Sam before we say goodbye.
Because Ian can't say it, some of his friends in the Conservative Party would quite like to get rid of Ollie Robbins, the Theresa May's chief Europe negotiator. But what I think you've heard most clearly over the last half an hour is that the red lines from Brussels that Adam read out and what Ian and his friends want to see are completely incompatible. There is either a time limit or there is not, and there is no way of fudging that.
So we've come back to the beginning of our discussion then. Sam Coates, thank you very much for coming in.
Now, ministers have agreed the so-called Irish backstop, an agreement that would avoid a hard border after Brexit, should have a time limit and not continue for more than a year after the end of the transition period. It follows reports that the Brexit Secretary David Davis was ready to step down unless there was a clear timeframe on the temporary customs arrangements which would be adopted if there is a no Brexit deal. Within the past few minutes, Mr Davis has been seen leaving Downing Street with the Trade Secretary Liam Fox after almost 3 hours of talks with the Prime Minister. For reaction, let's bring in Conservative MP and Brexiteer Peter Bone and Labour MP and Remainer Stephen Doughty, who both join us from central London. Gentlemen, many thanks indeed for joining us today. Peter Bone, if I can firstly start with you. The publication of this document, is it what you were hoping for?
Well, absolutely not. I don't think that there should be this so-called backstop. The backstop, of course, will become the first stop. If the EU knows that it can get away with this, it won't negotiate in good faith to us. And if we're saying it's because we need to get the technology ready for Max Fact, well, hang on. We've got the rest of the period until we come out in March 2019, plus a further period of the implementation period. It doesn't make any sense at all. Why would a few more months be needed? It's to me, unacceptable.
Stephen Doughty, it is unacceptable, according to Mr Bone.
Well, it's very interesting to hear Peter say that. I'm not surprised. I mean, what an absolute and utter farce this has become. The government fighting amongst itself in public. Senior government spokespeople briefing on and off the record, that the government and, the Prime Minister and David Davis are engaged in a game of chicken. This is about people's lives. This is about the future of our economy, the future of our trade, the future of our relationship on the island of Ireland and avoiding that hard border. What an absolute and utter shambles. This proposal is going to be dead on arrival in Brussels. It doesn't address any of the key issues, and yet this is what the government has spent the last 48 hours wrangling over and wasting time over. The real solution to all of this is let's stay in the customs union, let's stay in the single market, and fundamentally, given the shambles the government is making on this, let's put this back to the people in a people's vote.
I mean, Peter Bone, the date that we've been given is the end for December 2021, but it's not binding. If it was binding, would it make a difference to you?
No, it's not binding. You make a very good point. It was interesting, the Labour Party's position now is they want to stay in the EU, and not only do they want to stay in by virtue of what they're proposing, but they now want a second referendum on it. That's amazing. Labour's split down the middle. But in relation to this backstop thing, it's totally unnecessary. And in my view, we need to have someone who's driving the Brexit policy who absolutely believes in it. And that's the only chance. But I think we've probably got the time now.
Go, Peter.
Probably we've got to a stage now where we say a deal on world trade rules is much better than anything we could possibly get. And it may be the time just to say, we're not negotiating with you anymore, EU. You've been an impossible organisation to negotiate with. We're going to come out at the end of March next year, save £39 billion, regain our own fishing rights, have our own immigration policy, make our own trade deals, and make our own laws in our own country, judged by our own judges. That's what the people voted for in the referendum. And why is it so many politicians now are trying to stop that happening?
Peter Bone, I just want to pick up on what you said about, you want somebody who is driving the Brexit negotiations. I mean, are you calling for the Prime Minister to go? Who would you want to see leading those negotiations?
No, I mean, what I'm saying is the person that should be driving and in total control of these negotiations is David Davis. Now, he's undoubtedly a Brexiteer that the people trust. The problem is, I understand that there are officials and SPADs who are actually running the show in Brussels, and that's not acceptable. I want David Davis to give carte blanche to get us out of this dreadful European Union as soon as possible. And I think that's what the Prime Minister needs to do, and tell these Remoaners who are in government to listen to what the British people said.
And Remoaners in the Labour Party, Stephen Doughty?
Well, I think we can hear very clearly what Peter is saying there. I mean, he's essentially saying he doesn't have confidence in the Prime Minister, he doesn't have confidence in other members of the Cabinet, he doesn't have confidence in the officials who are dealing with these negotiations. And that just shows you what an utter farcical mess the government is in over this. This is the most serious issue facing the country since the Second World War, something that will affect every single person up and down this country, and indeed on the island of Ireland as well. And it's about jobs, it's about livelihoods, it's about standards, it's about our relationship with our nearest neighbours. The fantasy that the Brexiteers have put forward of, extra money for the NHS, that we're going to get all these magical trade deals. We've seen that absolutely scotched this week by Donald Trump imposing steel tariffs on our steel industry. The idea that we're going to get some sort of magical deal with the United States that's going to make up for the trade that we already have. 99% of trade going through Dover is with our EU neighbours. The minute we start putting up barriers to that is the minute we start doing damage to our businesses, and that is why we should stay in the customs union, in the single market. The government should get its act together. And as I said, let's put this whole deal back to the public. They're not being given what they were sold. I know people who voted leave in absolutely good faith. This is not what they were expecting, an utter shambles from the government with MPs attacking their own Prime Minister.
Peter Bone?
Well, I certainly didn't attack the Prime Minister, and that's quite clear what I said. I said I didn't want the officials and SPADs who don't believe in Brexit leading the negotiations. But the one thing is for sure, at the moment, we're not delivering what the people voted for, and that's what we have to do. We must. Labour can say it wants to stay in the EU. Labour can say it wants to have a second referendum. Labour can say it wants to stay in the single market. They were all rejected at the referendum. We have to do what the people voted for. That was the whole point. That was the whole point. And in the general election, the Labour Party supported everything we did.
You lost your majority.
No, they supported everything we did on the EU, and you've rowed back and changed. The Labour Party just cannot be trusted on this. But we have to prove as a government that we can be, and that we deliver what the British people want. And that's why I want somebody in charge of negotiation who believes in it.
Only 18% of the British public now think the negotiations are going well. That is a damning indictment on this government. You have cabinet ministers squabbling in public, briefing against each other, accusing the Prime Minister of deception, accusing her, saying that there's going to be a game of chicken between cabinet ministers. What an extraordinary way. This is the national interest we need to be talking about. Our jobs, our economy, our standards, our relationship on the island of Ireland. Let's not put peace and prosperity at risk. Let's put the people first, and that's why we should stay in the customs union, in the single market, and put the decision back to the people.
Stephen Doughty, just before we go on, I just want to just show you this reaction from Michel Barnier that we've got in the last hour or so. I mean, he said that the UK backstop should respect the EU single market and maintain the customs union integrity. I mean, there's a potential here that this could fall at the first hurdle if the EU 27 don't agree.
Well, absolutely, and he was very, very clear about this. And what the craziness about this situation is that actually we're not dealing with any of the fundamental issues that need to be resolved. This talk of avoiding the hard border in Ireland, which we all want to see, is not going to be solved by the technological solutions. David Davis has admitted it himself. This is about internal squabbles and fights within the government, within the Conservative Party, and they're putting those first instead of the national interest. We need to put the national interest first, and that means jobs, the economy, and our relationship on the island of Ireland. And that means single market, customs union, and putting this back to the people in a people's vote.
Peter Boone, does it matter if it does fall at the first hurdle, even if it compromises the situation with the...
Well, if it does fall at the first hurdle, it's a stupid suggestion. I mean, the point is, if we were an independent nation outside the EU, we don't have to create a hard border in Northern Ireland. There is a soft border there now. We can leave it like that. The idea that we would put a hard border up because we don't have a deal is absurd. That's why I think the time has come now to call off the negotiations, say it's impossible
and
to deal
crash
with
out with no deal.
No, that is absurd. That is why I'm saying no. You can't get away with that. That is why I'm saying we should announce that now. We should announce that now, and then what would happen is that we would be prepared at the end of March next year to do what the people voted for, which is to leave the European Union. And if we don't do that, I think democracy and faith in politicians will have been completely broken.
Peter, you just yourself described the Prime Minister and David Davis's proposal as a stupid suggestion. This is one they couldn't agree on themselves, and now you're describing it as a stupid suggestion and saying you're not surprised it's going to fall at the first hurdle. Where on earth does that leave your party and the government? You can't even agree amongst yourselves on something which is effectively kicking the can further down the road because you can't agree on the final arrangements that we want to have. It's an absolute shambles. You're not happy with it. David Davis isn't happy with it. And you're not happy with what the Prime Minister is doing.
I have said that now enough is enough. These negotiations are impossible in the European Union. No, crash out is completely wrong. If you say now you're going to come out of the European Union at the end of March 2019, there's plenty of time to be prepared for it. Crash out could only be seen by somebody who's totally in love with the European Union, and I guess that's what many in the Labour Party are.
Stephen Doughty, gentlemen, we are out of time, I'm afraid. A debate that will rumble on for some time to come. Many thanks indeed for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ministers have agreed that the so-called backstop arrangement for the Irish border, preventing the return of a hard border after Brexit, should have a time limit and not continue for more than a year after the end of the transition period. It follows reports that the Brexit Secretary David Davis was ready to step down unless there was a clear time frame on the temporary arrangements which would be adopted if there is no Brexit deal. Well, how has this gone down in Ireland? Let's go live to Dublin and Ireland's Europe Minister Helen McEntee. Hello to you, Helen McEntee. What's your response to it today?
Hiya. Well, I think, of course, it's important to welcome the fact that the UK government have put forward a written proposal in terms of the customs aspect of the backstop or the Irish protocol. Of course, we know that there are other elements that were agreed before Christmas in terms of regulation and alignment, but what we need to do now is allow the Commission and the task force, Michel Barnier, to take what has been proposed today, as he said himself earlier, to apply three very clear questions. Firstly, is it workable? Is it a legally operational solution? Secondly, does it in any way impact on the integrity of the single market and the customs union? And finally, will it work in all weathers? In other words, will it work in all circumstances? So I think we need to allow the Commission the time to apply those questions and then obviously see whether it warrants further investigation and further deliberations.
Guy Verhofstadt, the European Parliament's Brexit negotiator, though, appears to have preempted that, saying that this doesn't appear to be workable.
Well, again, I suppose it's just been published today. We need to allow the Commission time to look at it and apply those three questions. Indeed, you mentioned the element of the timeline. The Irish Government and indeed the task force have always been clear that the backstop would apply unless and until another workable solution in terms of the future relationship could address essentially all of the issues and avoid a border on the island of Ireland. So this backstop position, as agreed by Theresa May and the government before Christmas and again in March, would apply unless and until. So obviously until we have that other future relationship, which we absolutely prefer, and it is our preference to deal with the Irish border issue, until that is in place, this backstop must apply.
The expectation that the backstop will apply until the latest December 2021. Is that common sense?
Well, again, if we reach 2021 and no solution is found, or that the future relationship does not address all of the issues concerning Northern Ireland, which would avoid a border, then obviously the backstop would have to continue after that. So setting an exact date and a timeline for us is not acceptable. It's not in line with what was agreed beforehand.
It's very clear from the discussions going on in Westminster, though, that just would not be palatable.
Well, the Irish Government has been very clear, the task force have been very clear, and indeed the agreement that was reached with the UK Government before Christmas and again in March very clearly sets out that the backstop would fall into place unless and until, so it never suggests any particular timeline. Unless and until means until another solution is found and put into place. So as we've seen with the negotiations so far, almost 2 years on, deadlines have changed. We've seen timelines move as well, so to set a specific timeline for us is not acceptable, and it doesn't fall in line with what was agreed before Christmas and, as I've said, again in March. So obviously we want to work with what has been proposed. We have consistently said that we need to see in greater detail and in written format what the UK are proposing to address all of the issues that were agreed in terms of the backstop. And I think now it's time to take that proposal, to allow the Commission to apply those three questions that I mentioned earlier, and to see if we can actually take it and work from it, I think, and see if we can move from here onwards.
If there's no time limit, if there's no specific date, though, what is the incentive for the EU to reach an agreement with Britain on this?
Well, the backstop only applies to the scenario between Northern Ireland and the Republic. So obviously the future relationship is what kind of a relationship the UK will have with all of the 27 member states. So our preference has always been to address the Irish issues and the Irish concerns in relation to the border, and indeed the Good Friday Agreement and the peace process through that wider relationship. The backstop itself specifically only deals with the Irish issue, and for us it's important, and it's already been agreed by Theresa May as well, that it needs to be in the withdrawal agreement moving forward, in case when that future relationship is worked through, there is still the possibility of a border on the island of Ireland. So this is not our first preference, this is our last preference. Our first preference is to deal with these issues through the wider future relationship, and of course that applies to all 27 European member states and the EU, or the UK, not just Ireland and the UK and Northern Ireland.
OK, much to discuss at the upcoming summit. Helen McEntee, thank you very much indeed for talking to us this afternoon.
After a day of some drama at Westminster, the Prime Minister has seen off the possible resignation of her Brexit Secretary, David Davis. He had demanded a time limit on temporary arrangements to avoid a hard Irish border if no customs deal is reached with the EU. Theresa May has now committed the government to an expectation that the so-called backstop arrangement would end by the close of 2021. Here's our political editor, Laura Kuhnsberg.
Are you about to lose your Brexit Secretary, Prime Minister?
She has a lot on. But Theresa May's first job today was to prevent disaster, to stop the man who's meant to be in charge of Brexit from flouncing out. David Davis was summoned to an early meeting behind the Commons gates, behind closed doors. Other ministers were trying to embrace the day.
And one of the nice things about this beautiful summer's day is that it's an opportunity, of course, for me to have a chat with my colleagues about the important issues that we're dealing with.
An hour of discussion, but back into the jag with no agreement. David Davis was threatening to quit if the Prime Minister didn't put a specific date for a time limit into a government document. The plan for customs after Brexit, if new ways of managing can't be found. Who would budge?
Are you going to resign, Mr. Davis?
Downing Street was sweating. At stake, not just this proposal, but the fortunes of the government itself. A nervous wait during nearly another hour of talks. But then David Davis's team claimed victory. The document would, after all, include a date. With this crucial line, the UK expects the future arrangement to be in place by the end of December 2021. In other words, the Brexit Secretary had made the Prime Minister move.
Foreign Secretary, isn't it rather a problem that the Cabinet have been bullying the Prime Minister in public?
No mistake, it's another fudge, not a concrete commitment to anything.
The smile on Boris Johnson's face as he left a long meeting suggests one thing. Some senior Brexiteers in government believe they have won.
After today's very public power struggle, look who's sure he won.
David Davis.
David Davis taking his time, savouring the moment, even though by tomorrow his advantage may seem hollow.
I think it's particularly true of Theresa May's government that does operate by collective responsibility. We do come to collective decisions.
Arguing in public?
Well, sometimes that takes a little bit longer. Leaving the European Union is one of the most important things that we've done in this country for a very long time. It's important we get the decisions right. As everybody knows from the referendum, opinions and feelings run high on this issue, but what we've shown that we can reach an agreement civilly and collectively.
But on the other side of the channel, that can look like chaos.
We just received this proposal 2 hours ago and we are working on it. Huh?
The EU doesn't much like the look of the proposal anyway. There'll be a formal response tomorrow. Try, as the Chief Whip does, to be positive. The government looks split.
The Brexit Secretary has had his way, although what's been done is not a clear plan of his liking, but a fudge, which will mean that the government can stay intact for now.
As the Prime Minister's bags were packed for a trip abroad, she kept the government together, just. Yet she leaves behind the risk of bad compromise. Contradictions still all around. Laura Kunsberg, BBC News, Downing Street.
Now, the backstop stops here, or at least at the end of 2021, or at least that's the expectation, after ministers spent the morning in talks about the future of the Irish border. Rumours were flying around all morning that the Brexit Secretary, David Davis, might resign unless the customs arrangement had a clear time limit. But Downing Street said that after constructive talks with Mrs May, Mr Davis would be staying put. Here's our political editor, Gary Gibbon.
Cameras and journalists tracked David Davis's every move this morning. Headlines overnight speculated he might be about to resign. In recent times, there have been similar headlines, sometimes almost monthly. But this latest scare merited an emergency meeting with Theresa May. It took place in the Prime Minister's office in the House of Commons. Boris Johnson and Liam Fox also had separate meetings with Mrs May in the same room. Both wanted it to be made clear that the fallback position Britain is promising the EU will apply if there's no wider agreement. Effectively, staying in the customs union cannot become a permanent state. In the end, they did agree the text of the UK negotiating position on a backstop. It's been published, sent on to Brussels. It says again and again, this is a backstop, not the government's central proposition. Not many people seem to believe that. It also says it should be time limited. Brussels says that's completely impossible. It goes on to say it expects the future arrangement, that's the technological solution that replaces the customs union, to be in place by the end of December 2021 at the latest. Not many British government officials seem to think that's remotely possible, and in Brussels they think it's laughable. A more diplomatic public response from the EU chief negotiator. Michel Barnier tweeted, "I welcome the proposal on aspects of the backstop. It will be tested to see if it can avoid a hard border, respect the integrity of the single market and the customs union, and is it an all-weather backstop?" Theresa May, now on her way to the G7 summit in Canada, knows this proposal is silent on the bigger component of how you get a frictionless border between Northern Ireland and Ireland: regulatory controls over goods. One Whitehall source said Number 10 is terrified how Tory MPs will react when they hear how the backstop provides for the UK to stay signed up to EU rules on manufactured goods even after the transition period has ended. Pro-Brexit ministers emphasise this is the backstop position, not the government's main negotiating position. They insist Britain will be fully out of the EU and its institutions before the next election.
There is no mechanism here by which the European Union can keep the United Kingdom in any arrangement longer than that period which we've specified. There has to be an end to the period. We said we're leaving the European Union in March 2019, we agreed to an implementation period to make it easier for our businesses and our trading partners. We've taken this extra step if everything else is agreed, and we need a little more time to make it work. But we have to leave, and we have to be outside the European Union, and Britain needs to be ready at the next election to prepare a government for a post-EU Britain.
But some of the pro-Brexit ministers' backbench supporters don't buy that.
This is a method of keeping us in. It's been done by the Remoaners around the Prime Minister, the officials and the SPADs. They have got to be sidelined. We've got to have someone in charge who really believes in Brexit. In my view, David Davis should be given a completely free hand, and these officials should be, well, to be honest, got rid of.
One official said today augurs badly for the even more critical phases of the process still to come. The Tory party held together today, but has many tests of unity ahead. Well, the negotiating position out today is a very far cry from the big, bold Brexit brassy language that Theresa May was using when she first came to power, glorified on the front page of the Daily Mail as the new Margaret Thatcher taking on Europe. Now she's squeezing the Brexiteers, and they know it. And by way of an apology and to try and smooth things over, she's written to all Tory MPs tonight, and she's told them she accepts that this backstop position is unpalatable. And she emphasises that it is in no way the government's intended or desired future customs arrangement. But she herself did a slideshow presentation with her Chief of Staff, Gavin Barwell, earlier this week to pro-Remain Tory MPs, those who might rebel next week. And they're coming away hoping that, in fact, this is the government position. And it's not at all temporary. It might be semi-permanent or permanent altogether. So it's hoped, I think, in Downing Street that this proposal today, although it's upset a lot of Brexiteers, has calmed down some of the nerves amongst the Remainers. We'll find out about that next week. I'm not sure it's got her that far with Brussels. They'll be poring over this, but they'll be waiting for the other half of the policy, the bit about regulatory alignment, as it were, the single market. What do we do about goods? And number 10 is very, very frightened about how it's going to sell that to MPs, which is why you haven't heard about it yet.
Gary Gibbon in Westminster.
Now, tomorrow, it's actually a year since last year's general election, and the Conservative Party has been readying itself for the anniversary celebrations by threatening its own implosion. David Davis was reportedly set to resign today. He didn't, but he and other Brexiteers do fear the project is slipping away. The government set out a vision of its version of the last resort solution to the Irish border problem. Now, that's only if all else fails, but it does envisage the UK remaining tied to elements of the customs union, to the EU's VAT system. And as I say, it may not happen, or it may not happen for long, but it could easily end up as the semi-permanent outcome. So it is a tumultuous time for Brexit and the Tories. Well, I'm joined by Peter Bone, Conservative MP and Brexit enthusiast. Also two commentators with a close ear to what is going on in the Conservative Party. Fraser Nelson, editor of The Spectator. Lucy Fisher, chief political correspondent at The Times. But let me start with our own political editor, Nick Watt. So, Nick, just take us through today's developments. And David Davis is kind of in, out. Isn't he going to resign?
That's right. David Davis, I'm told, is telling friends that it was a score draw between him and the Prime Minister. And if it's a score draw with the Prime Minister, then that means that he won. He's saying that he secured two things. Firstly, he got an end date in that document for the so-called Northern Ireland backstop, but it is an aspirational end date. It is not a definite end date. The other thing he's saying he's got is an end to the backsliding on the publication of a white paper on Brexit. He says that will come out before the end of July, and it will have the government's preferred option for how you deal with the customs relationship, not that backstop. So why are these Brexit ministers worried? Essentially, as you were saying there, they fear that their vision of Brexit is slipping away. And the reason for that is they think Theresa May wants two things in March: out of the EU, but also a transition. And if you want a transition, you have to have a withdrawal treaty. If you want a withdrawal treaty, you have to have the backstop. And the danger of the backstop for the Brexiteers is that hands the EU an absolutely decisive role in the end state.
Right. Just very briefly, because there was other news tonight. The Boris Johnson leaked tape of him talking to a group last night.
pretty extraordinary intervention by Boris Johnson, leaked to Lucy at the Times, to BuzzFeed and to Guido Fawkes, essentially saying that the Treasury are scared of Brexit and want to keep us in the EU orbit, saying that Donald Trump would do a much better job in negotiating Brexit, but importantly saying that Theresa May, he thinks, will start to go hardball. So, look, this is a flavour of what he said. Okay.
And the risk is that we will end up in a sort of anti-room of the EU, locked in orbit around the EU, in the customs union and to a large extent in the single market. So not really having full freedom on our trade policy, our tariff schedules, and not having freedom with our regulatory framework either. Just the lunar pull of the EU.
Bit muffly, but we're grateful to you, Lucy, because you gave us that. That tape. Do you agree that the Brexiteers are worried, first of all, and do you think Boris Johnson's comments last night reflect that? Because quite a lot was said on that in that evening.
Yes, certainly he's worried. He made that absolutely clear. And I think, in particular, his punchy broadside at the Treasury, accusing the department of being at the heart of Remain, was pretty hard-hitting. It was interesting to me, the long transcript. He spoke at a dinner that lasted more than an hour last night. He talked about how he believed people in the Treasury were were so concerned about what he felt were trumped-up fears about the short-term economic pain that will be entailed by leaving the EU, which he accepted, that they're willing to sacrifice the long-term benefits of Brexit.
Yeah, well, of course, the Treasury don't think there'll be those long-term benefits anyway, I suppose. Fraser, other resignations, Boris Johnson even.
Well, there was talk that David Davis and Boris would both resign today if we didn't get that date. But there's talks all the time of flouncing out. And even now, David Davis is expected to resign just at a slightly later date when it can achieve something. There's not much point in either of them resigning now. They've got the date. Michel Barnier will probably say, no, I don't agree with this end date. And we can kind of see what's going to happen now. If the British government has spelt out its so-called backstop position, and the EU prefer this to the deal, why would they bother to do
But
a
hang
deal?
on, the EU don't officially actually like the British version of the backstop.
Well, they don't like... Their position is to reject every single thing the British come up with and wait until there's another concession and another concession. Right now, I think the backstop will probably be the most favoured option of the EU. They also know they've got to be careful, because if they're too intransigent and the Parliament doesn't vote for any deal, then the default will be no deal, or rather, world trade deal.
Yeah. Peter Bone, you're a fervent Brexiteer. Basically, the government is taking us towards the backstop deal, which is a pretty soft Brexit.
Well, it's not even a soft Brexit. We're not coming out. The idea that there's a date in the document, well, it's an aspiration.
Yeah, David Davis was just deluding himself.
Well, I read it. I mean, the more I read the document, the more depressed I got. Basically, it allows us to stay effectively in the EU indefinitely. They've crossed the red line. It's not acceptable. And many of my colleagues on the back benches won't support it, and I certainly won't.
But I'll tell you why a lot of Tories would disagree with Peter. We will still be leaving the EU in March. We'd be getting control over the borders. The money to the EU be going down. These are lots of pretty big wins. Now, people like Peter would say, look, if we're not in the still in the customs union, there's no real Brexit. But a lot of other Tories just want this over.
Well, and you're a Brexiteer who kind of is OK about the customs union, in fairness, aren't you? You don't have a problem.
It's not something I would die in a ditch over.
Yeah. But Peter Bone, what happens? Well, what has to happen to rescue the Brexit you want, the hard Brexit you want?
Well, actually, you just said it. I mean, it might be Mr Barnier. He might say, oh, God, we can't agree to any of this, and we effectively fall out. Now, that's not what I want to say. I want Theresa May to say now, look, we've tried a negotiation. It's all a bit of a mess. We'll go for a world trade deal. We're going to have no more negotiations with you. We're going to come out of the EU end of March next year, where we will save £39 billion to start with. We can impose our own immigration policy. We get back our own fisheries. We can make our own trade deals. We make our own laws.
No transition.
Yeah. And of course, if you say it now, you've got enough time to put it in place. And people will say about Northern Ireland...
But are we ready? Are we ready for that?
Well, that's what I'm saying.
We don't have the customs posts. We don't have...
Well,
it feels like they've been doing more preparation for this than we have.
Well, I would argue, first of all, we don't have to put any tariffs on. So therefore, in Northern Ireland, we won't have a border.
That's actually against WTO rules. I need to point that out.
Well,
you have to have a border under WTO rules.
Don't WTO rules say there has to be sincere cooperation between
Well,
and that means if you've got a line, they couldn't impose tariffs on us. So the legal situation, I don't care. I just want to come out. Let's announce it. Let's deliver what the British people wanted.
And you couldn't come out to a very soft Brexit, EEA or something like that, for 5 years while Britain thinks, considers and goes and works out how to harden the Brexit, if that's what we want to do.
I know
after 5
it's
years.
difficult to remember, but 2 years ago we had a referendum and we voted to come out of this wretched thing. And while people want to keep us in and put all these... The people voted to come out. So let's just do it. And I tell you, from my party's point of view, if we don't come out, we are in big trouble.
Because a lot of businesses would say it'd be very costly. Do you think, Lucy, the hard version of Brexit, the original government view, can still happen?
I think it's very unlikely. I mean, you did hear Boris Johnson last night still maintaining that no deal is better than a bad deal. But really, the Prime Minister's shown today, in the language she used in this Brexit blueprint that's now finally been published, she's in a compromising mode. She called it herself an unpalatable option. It shows how far she's willing to go. And I don't pick up in the corridors of Westminster that there are that many senior Brexiteers who are in line with Boris, willing to kind of crash out on WTO rules.
It was interesting. I was talking to somebody today who knows Theresa May's mind, and there's essentially three sorts of Brexit. There's out, there's a big negotiation, and there's what Theresa May wants in the middle, which is a bespoke negotiation. And this person who knows her very well said that is impossible. It's the big negotiation or it's the...
Yeah, because the EU have just said you have a menu of two. Yeah. If it's no deal, or we sort out Northern Ireland with the backstop and...
And we are likely to be dragged in to the worst situation if we don't do something about it now. We can't announce in the autumn that it's effectively what people call a no deal, because there really is no time to prepare. So that's why what we have to do...
Well, there isn't time to prepare now, by the way. Just
well, no, we are going to disagree on that point. But what Theresa May, it's very simple. All Theresa May has to do is get rid of all these Remainer officials and spads and put someone in charge who actually believes in Brexit, like David Davis.
OK, don't dominate Peter. Peter's other problem is the parliamentary arithmetic, isn't it? Now, what are the rebels doing, Nick?
Well, next week we have the withdrawal bill coming back, and I was speaking to somebody on the pro-European side who said it'll be a big parliamentary event, but they don't believe there'll be a big government defeat. The government's tabled some amendments in lieu. But essentially the deal between Theresa May and the pro-Europeans is she says, don't defeat me next week because you'll weaken my hand in the June Council in Brussels where I'm doing things that you like. But you can have your chance in July.
Defeat me in July.
The trade bill will come back then. The rebels have already put an amendment down on the EEA, got 14 signatures, and there is already an amendment to take the UK into a customs union.
Is that possibly going to potentially win, Fraser?
Well, I right now can't see any version of Brexit was going to get majority support in Parliament. And if there isn't, then no deal is the default. People forget Parliament has already endorsed and voted for no deal with Article 50. So I'd say there is a non-negligible chance that we might end up with this hard Brexit, not because people want it, but because they can't agree on what they'd rather have instead.
Lucy, who benefits from the Theresa May strategy, just kicking the can down the road, delaying and delaying what feels like the ultimate showdown between the hard and the soft version?
Well, I mean, there's nothing else she can really do, is there? I mean, she's been between a rock and a hard place. The majority, I think there is parliamentary arithmetic there in the Commons to keep the UK inside a customs union. So she's stuck with enough Tory pro-EU rebels, numbering about 13, 14, in the Commons, and then on the other hand, you've got the ERG, the sort of Brexiteers, of whom Peter's one.
No, I'm sorry.
He's not
on the ERG, but also one of the
Brexiteers
Brexiteers who, you know, especially with the summer season parties, warm Prosecco upon us, could be plotting this summer to oust her if they think that she's not going to go their way.
Back into the season of warm Prosecco, my goodness. Thank you all very much indeed.